and it is a unique opportunity to showcase also what the Caribbean has to offer in different ways. Our next speaker actually embodies all these three partners. At one moment in time, he was the Minister of Tourism. He's an academic. I'm not sure if he worked at the Department of Tourism, but everything else he did supported that. So you are a honorary ATA member. Robertico Croes is a scholar, now professor emeritus at the Rosen College of Hospitality, and he truly embodies hospitality in the Caribbean way. If you look at his career, his publications, and the several contributions he's had in doing research, providing evidence for policy, supporting policy, and all the other activities that ensued, teaching, supervising graduate students, making sure that the next generation of leaders for the Caribbean are ready to take the lead, you will see that the global lessons truly are rooted in local experiences. His talk today is titled Small Islands, Big Questions, Tourism, Identity, and the Meaning of Belonging. We hope that after this conference, you also feel that you belong to Curacao, the Caribbean, and it all starts today with Dr. Robertico Croes.
Good morning. Good morning, welcome. I'm very honored and, feeling very, very good to be back at the University of Curacao. It's been quite a while since I've been here. This is my first experience with this network. So what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about my research in the past 15 years, focusing very specifically on small islands in the Caribbean and beyond. Of course, the focus will be the Caribbean, but we will use also some examples in other islands. What I also tried to do during my talk is to weave the themes, I think you have 4 themes, into my conversation with you today, and link our research with those themes, and hopefully that can, provoke thoughts, inspire new methods, or actually new principles of how to focus on problems of small islands. The title about Small Islands, Big Questions has been, around for quite some time. A lot of new things have come from small islands because small islands are considered a lab for social systems, economic experiments. For example, we have the destination life cycle of Butler, came out from Caribbean observations. So that's very important. I will share with you some of our own thoughts with regard to how to approach some problems or some challenges that small islands may have. So specifically, I'm going to talk in the next 30 to 35 minutes about 3 lessons that I've learned. One is the absence of economic alignment in research. We will notice, based on a publication that we did, a disconnect between research at universities and small islands and the economic social realities of small islands. That's very important, and it's not only hampers or hinders innovative pipelines, but also it affects persons, their dreams, their aspirations, their expectations. So this is very, very important, how we must look at universities as engine of transformation and research that are, aligned to the realities of small islands. The second lesson is about well-being as such, combining objective and subjective indicators and how that kind of gel into small islands, and then finally tourism as a capability space. So these are the three lessons that I would like to cover today. A few years back, a group of us from the University of Mauritius, Rosen College, we decided to have a look at, what is it that research on small islands really generates in the past 10 years. We went over 167,000 articles, journal articles. We looked at those articles, we studied them, and we found something very disconcerting. The misalignment, the disconnect between realities, island realities, and what the research was telling us. Not that the research was not important. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, for example, in many islands, for example, tourism is the mainstay, but very few publications about tourism in small islands. And I'll give some examples. And partially, the problem is with the premise. The premise is that the researchers think that problems are very homogeneous. They don't, for example, look very, very carefully at what a small island represents, what is the characteristics, what are the layers that really form and converge into what a small island destination is. So therefore, the focus is very much on continue what they have learned at universities and focus on these big questions. What you have noticed as well is that the fact that of this premise has led to very generalized type of recommendations, actions, managerial implications, and even theoretical implications, for that matter, that we will discuss and I will share with you later. So my key insight of this article is basically that small islands need frameworks grounded in their realities, not borrow from blueprints. And that is something that for example, I recommend if you're really interested in small islands to go to this article and see what, we have a table with categories of research, a lot of marine biology, for example, but very, very few studies. I think 3 islands or 3 universities which are embedded in islands really have focused a little bit on tourism. But this brings us with theme 3, tourism and leisure industries, because, for example, what we have seen is in the case of St. Lucia, I don't know whether you remember how the EU decided to fade out the banana preferences. And what happened was that there was no research of the regional university really to pivot to agriculture or agri-processes. So there was no way that they were focusing on real innovation and on looking at potential value chain supplies, for example, or branding or marketing. So what happened next is that the whole industry collapsed. And when we're talking about the industry, it's not only the industry, but also the people. It goes with it, right? I don't have to really, talk about the details of the people, but think about someone working, losing his job, cannot pay mortgage, cannot really, pay for children to go to school or school supplies, for example. But that's part of the story. Imagine that suddenly what you thought was possible was no longer possible because research was not there to help guide you in terms of your opportunities, in terms of, your hope. And I'll talk a little bit about hope later on, not as something soft, but as something very, very important in terms of motivating agency and so on. In Aruba, where I'm from, 60% or more is based on tourism. We looked in the past 10 years, I think there might be, from the University of Aruba, 2 or 3 studies. I mean, I'm from Aruba, I've been 25 years in the United States. By the way, I'm retired in May, so I'm very happy. I have published more articles about Aruba than the whole University of Aruba. And I can say even of the University of Curacao. So it means that somehow, we are not really geared to look at the realities and the needs of the people that we're supposed to serve as a university. And that's important. And what I learned is, my background is an applied economist, and I started, very much in numbers and macro indicators, looking at business cycles and looking at elasticities and so on, and economic impact and leakages. However, my main research purpose has always been focusing on how to enhance opportunities for people. So I focus on poverty, and particularly in Latin America. And what I learned was that numbers, is not only tell you a part of the story, but they can really mislead you completely, because you're not talking to the people. You're not looking at, or you're not feeling their experience. You're not talking about their experience. And I will show you how our research has evolved and how we found this misalignment between, capabilities, and the numbers look good, but people feel completely alienated or not belonging, in that particular vision, which is very, very important. And what happens when that happens is that people start feeling that they don't have agency in this whole process. So there is erosion of agency. When there is erosion of agency, people feel not motivated, right? When there is a not motivated, maybe people feel that, change is impossible. They cannot change. So that is something that, we learn from really looking very carefully at these 67,000 articles across the 38 SITs in the world. So what does our research reveal? And these are 3 insights that I want to share very quickly with you, and then we'll go over the evidence. Tourism drives growth, but growth alone is not enough. Human capital is the beating heart of island development, not physical capital. There's a lot of discussion about that. So, invest in roads, invest in hotels, and so on. But it is people that really, human capital, that makes the difference. And I'll explain why in tourism that's the case. And the third insight is traditional metrics conceal more than they reveal. So let's look at the first. This is a book that I published a few years back about small islands and constrained economies. And I focus very much solely on economic growth and how to maintain the momentum of economic growth on the islands. What we learn is, for example, while there is in general a positive trend, which means a positive relationship between, economic growth and tourism revenues, that relationship is not automatic. It depends on multiple, dimensions, on multiple elements or components. One of the things is that we have always looked at that relationship, which comes from the tourism-led growth hypothesis, that the income elasticity is stable, right? So if we look at 2 forces of tourism, one is an external force and one is an internal force. The external force is the source country. So what it means is in tourism is the richer the country, the wealthier the country, the higher the probability that that country will engage in tourism, right? Tourism is a luxury good. So of course, the elasticity is above 1. But over the years, till 2013-15, we always thought that that income elasticity is stable, till when we looked at it. We compared Aruba, we compared Barbados, and we realized that is not the case. And the reason for that is because the external factor, we have little control in, for example, telling the United States, okay, increase your income. We cannot say that as a small. What we can do is to manage the internal part, the dynamic of the forces. And that will bring us later on the concept of well-being and residence. And that is very critical because we learn about prices. We talk with the tourists all the time. Tourists come here, You know, you are a tourist, for example, you come here, you talk to the locals find out about your taste and preferences, they kind of measure your consumer surplus, your price points, and they develop products. And that can generate and motivate, trigger entrepreneurship, etc. So that's very important. And that domestic element is really critical in understanding why some islands do better than others. There is a space between, you know, what I expect and what I aspire. And development happens in that space, okay? Which means that development can fail or succeed within that space. And again, that's something that we will talk about later on. That is the growth. And we have seen that, in general, tourism has this impact. And it is not so much about how much you get from tourism, but how do you use those revenues? That's very, very critical. In our research, we have noticed that the use of those receipts are critical to the success of an island development in terms of inclusivity, sustainability, and so on. So because the domestic aspect layer of the tourism dynamic is so critical, we decided to look at, okay, what is it that residents, you know, perceive from tourism? There has been a lot of discussion in the past. Sergi, Yusil, and all these people, for example, talked about the impact of tourism on communities and hence on how these the impact either trigger support for tourism development or not. What we did in our research at Central Florida was basically, okay, the impact on the community is not the same as the impact of an individual. I can feel very positive about how Curacao is going, as Zuleika just mentioned, but maybe from Bandabal, I don't feel that that's good for me. It's good for the community, but not good for me. So we decided to change the focus on community and more on the individual, on the person, and ask the person directly, are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? Is your life ideal? Do you have the conditions in life that help you become a happier person, and so on? And that changed the whole equation in terms of how the landscape of how you look at the problem and how you frame the problem. In this particular slide, what we did was we looked at the objective. Oh. What happened? Oh, I'm sorry. I have to take care of that. I'm sorry. My apologies. I'm looking at I thought it was automatic. So what we did was we looked at more than 20 islands in the world. And we looked at the objective reality of what it means of economic growth versus Human Development Index. As you know, the Human Development Index consists of 3 components, you know, income, education, and health, okay? And it is an objective way of measuring whether a particular destination or country is doing well from an objective standpoint on well-being. And we compare that with tourism. You know, in order to make it visible, we provide a natural log for each axis. What we see here is a concave relationship. What does it mean, this concave relationship? It means that beyond a certain point of income, no matter how much money you gave to someone, no matter how much possession that person has, no matter how much material resources you provide to the person, the happiness or satisfaction level of that person start plateauing and then slowly diminishing, okay? And that is what we're seeing in small islands. In certain islands, it's really, you can see at the top, you know, here, that it's really plateauing. For example, in Aruba, Malta, US Virgin Islands, Turks and Caicos and so on that's plateauing. And I'll talk a little bit more about Aruba very specifically in order to explain a little bit why this is occurring. Okay? There have been some research saying that after $20,000 income per capita, if you provide more money to a person without looking at other, layers, that will not help. And the reason it will not help is because at that point, what comes into place is social comparison. And then social comparison basically neutralizes all the material possessions or material gains that you have received. So we did a study in Malta back then in 2018, I think. And we were there. We looked at the objective realities of Malta. And what we found is Malta was one of the top with a very high HDI and also a high GDP per capita. But there was no link between, tourism development and the HDI. There was statistically no relationship. And we did very rigorous econometric analysis in order to support that. And what we noticed was that they focused on two things. They focused on a lot of physical investment and also the influx of migrants. So that created two problems. One is human capital turned out to be very, very critical. A crucial determinant of pushing is the channel between HDI and tourism, and the effect of the migrant was that leakage was not generated or caused by profits from multinational, because that's the traditional view, but it is from remittances. Remittances and also the suppression of wages. So these are two things which turn out to be very, very important. So what we learned, our insight from Malta study was that it is critical not only to push tourism for more arrivals and receipts, people spending more, but how do you use that money? That was the critical insight of this. And the use of the money in this particular case is very clear. You should invest more in human capital. And so that was the main thing. And the other thing which we learned also is we didn't understand at that time why they had accessibility, but still accessibility did not really report a strong relationship with HDI. And allow me to tell you a story as a side story here. In my studies in Mexico about poverty and tourism, I visited a farmer called Don Pedro in Colima, Mexico. Colima is a Mexican state close to the Pacific. And Don Pedro was in his front porch in a humble home, and there were about 5 or 6 children, 6, 7 years old, roaming the porch, which I later learned that they were his grandchildren. 2 blocks from there was a brand new school. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. I asked Don Pedro, but why are you not sending your children to school? This there. And he told me, look, I would like them to go. The World Bank just built that school. I would like them to go. If they go, I would invest 12 years into these children. Elementary school, high school. And then the uncertainty of no jobs. I need them right now. Not 12 years from now, I don't have that time. So what I'm trying to say is, while accessibility is important, that particular project, that school, was functionally irrelevant to Don Pedro's family, to his dreams, to his hopes, because they never spoke to him. They never tried to learn about his experience and what he needed in that sense. So his grandchildren were not going to school, but working in the farm in order to bring food on the table, because that is what they needed right away. Very rational, Because there was, in the literature, there's also poor people do not entertain the same rationality as non-poor people. In this particular case, I thought it was very rational, and how do we really align those two in terms of functionally relevant to his reality with accessibility. So that really brought me to, afterwards, after publishing this article, what was it exactly that we should look at. And that brings me to lesson 2. So in studies that we did in 3 islands, Aruba, Mauritius, and Malta, again, there was very strong macroeconomic indicators. High GDP per capita, high HDI, health accessibility, health insurance, for example, universal health insurance, universal education access, but still, the life satisfaction was relatively low. At the lower, if you have a Likert scale of 5, was about 3.2, 3.1. To the neutral side, even though you have all these, basically, for example, in Aruba, almost 80% own their own houses. And still, they're not completely happy. They're not satisfied with their lives. So, again, maybe same resource of the 3, but different outcome. So the insight is, it is not what I'm trying to say is, if you look only at what people have, their possessions, we will not really learn about their full life, their complete life. And that misalignment may lead to misleading actions or what have you. So that is very, very important. And I cover that a lot in my most recent book, A Journey to Happiness, where I compare multiple islands in the world about where I link, 2 components of tourism, mobility and space, how those two things relate to happiness, satisfaction of life, and also about the conditions of life, ideal life, and the determinants of happiness and satisfaction with life in small islands. So, having said that, and I'm moving slowly to my lesson 3 here, is that we've seen that there is a disconnect with, with the research at university in small islands, with realities. Then the focus is, what we found should be more on the human capital side instead of the physical side, more on the feelings and the experience, than the possessions, so providing a more holistic view of well-being and also of development. And then my last point, or actually the transition that I want to make is, okay, how can we change that? How should we look at this particular problem? How should we frame that particular problem? And that is, what I'm proposing here. What we're saying is we are combining the objective and the subjective. So we are looking at specifically 2 aspects when we talk to someone. We look at how ideal is your life and what are the conditions of your life. And if the aspirations, the hope, and the conditions or expectations, if the gap is big, and we compare that with the material possession, which is the HDI, the objective indicators, then we can get a sense about, in what situation that person is. We can start measuring the emotional capital of a person, which is very, very important, because the emotional capital is what really triggers more agency, what you feel, what you hope for, and so on. So we did, and this is the, you can have 2 by 2. I'm sorry, maybe it's not very legible from here, but it's a 2 by 2, high and low. So on the top is high HDI, low HDI, high gap, and low gap. Okay? And when we apply that to some islands, we will see some very interesting patterns, and we can understand better what's going on and how we should really be more specific in terms of what the residents want. And again, we focus a lot on residents, because that is the human capital that really pushes tourism to make the shift from transaction to a transformative power force with the local residents. So what does it tell us? It can pinpoint frustration. For example, we have high aspiration, but then the conditions in order to achieve those are very, very low. It can provide potential, where the two of them are aligned. It can show resilience. There is a drop, and then you put, over time, show they come back. Or they can show resignation. There is a concept in the literature called learned helplessness, that really talk about these things that we have to think about. But also it provides social meaning to positions, to whether people are motivated, whether they feel they have agency or not in order to achieve something. They want to become entrepreneur, are they willing, really to put the efforts into that? Do they see career advancement in hospitality, for example, or not? So we have to understand what the literature called positional objectivity of each person in order to really come up with a framework that will help or will enhance their opportunities as persons. So what we did is from 2016 to 2019, more or less, we collected close to 3,000 surveys in Aruba, Curacao, and the Bahamas. And when we look at these three islands, we will see, based on these scores, and I'm only looking at two dimensions here, the aspirations and the expectations, and the standard deviation. Okay, I don't, really go deeper to that for this particular presentation, but only those two, the mean and the standard deviation. So what do we learn from this? In the case of Aruba, this is the reality. Basically, long story short, is because of the high and rapid development of Aruba, because of tourism specialization, what triggered after that achievement of this high level was the social comparison, snuck in. And the difference between Curacao, because it happened in Curacao as well, the difference between the two is Aruba looked at social comparison, going up. What does it mean? They don't look at social comparison from a perspective of the past. They looked at the tourist. They look at those Arubans coming back to the country, and they kind of internalize their lifestyle, and they want to be the same. But they are not, in the sense that they don't have the conditions in order to reach, their aspirations. So it is a typical, what we call in the literature, the Easterling paradox, where after a certain amount of income or wealth, there is no way that you can really, satisfy them with only, higher wages and so on. And the other thing what we learn is that, in particular in Aruba, we did a very deep survey with hotel workers. And what we learned is they constantly think about resigning. They're not resigning because there are not that many opportunities. So because in Aruba, as you can see, the standard deviation is relatively low, there is a social cushion of norms. They're saying, you have to be realistic. This is what we can achieve. But their aspiration has shot to the roof. And that is what we're seeing right now in Aruba, fewer and fewer emotions or stable emotions, more emotional strain among the workers and people in general in terms of the belonging part of residents. In Curacao, the results is different. This is Aruba. This is Curacao. In Curacao, social comparison happens going down, not up. What does it mean? People, residents, look at their past and look at others who are less fortunate than them. So therefore, they're saying, well, I'm much better than those that I'm comparing myself to. So therefore, they are more content, more happy with their current life situation. But the downside of that is that it affects the motivation for change. It masks resilience to more or less being content with something that is not really helping, or promoting resilience in that sense. So that's Curacao. Now let's look at the Bahamas. The Bahamas is really interesting because Bahamas had the lowest gap between aspiration and expectation. It was closer to the neutral point, functional neutrality, about 3, which means that they don't have any push to move up, or they are not that really scared about losing what they have. But what happened is that when you compare that with their score on happiness, on life satisfaction, you will see that the stability or the stable emotions that they have compared to their life conditions gives you a sense that it is more a coping mechanism than really that they're trying to change, do something different, or being more engaged with innovation, entrepreneurship, and so on. And this is also something that we did with hotel workers, and it shows a similar pattern in that respect. However, all 3 islands show the same pattern, and it's very typical of small islands. One is that whenever you have stable emotions, you have a higher life satisfaction. So the way you deal with that is that you think that as long as I can have consistent, achievement or opportunities, then I'm happier. And we see that in the case of the Bahamas compared to Aruba and Curacao. Wherever there is uncertainty, people feel the strain, emotional fatigue, and so on. And it's a clear result of behavioral economics, where uncertainty is dealt, with a lot of strain compared to where you have stability or consistency in that. Brings me to how should we look at tourism development? And this will be my last few slides. I think it's very important, as I try to, convince you at least, that it is important, critical, to combine the objective with the subjective part, to learn the lived experiences of the residents. It's not only looking at whether they have a job, whether they have a salary, but also look at their experience. The experience in all the dimensions: work, home, street, neighborhood, community, and so on. So that's very, very crucial. So that's one aspect that I want to emphasize here, and it's relational. Development is not only about curves, about growth, but it is relational. It's about identity. It's about context. that we have to look at and when we frame that. And the other important thing is, I already spoke about Bahamas, is that I looked at two principles since about 4 or 5 years, since just right before COVID, that we decided that we have to change the way we approach this problem. We know the framing, but how do we approach this problem? And we use two very important principles. One is empathy, and the other is belonging. Why empathy? Empathy is as infrastructure, what we call empathy as infrastructure, is the same as, for example, building roads. You need to maintain it, you need to have the resources for that. And empathy has, three important elements. It's cognitive, you understand the experience. That's very important. It has an affection to it. It's not only understand, but you feel it. And then it has a compassionate part, which motivates you to look, to come up with actions in order to assist people to enhance what they're doing. And we change our research in that perspective. And how do you measure that? You measure that, for example, we can look at, or how do you do it, the empathy? You talk to people, you start talking to people to learn, understand their problem. For example, you check whether they have been involved in any of the programs, activities of tourism and leisure at the destination. You also ask whether their voices have been heard, whether they have been really recognized, have they been involved. You can measure in terms of their participation in meetings. You can also use, remember I said in my book about mobility, how big is the migration going outside of the destination of the small island, which is an indication about people not feeling that they belong, with that particular, in that vision, for example, that is critical. So that is something that we are using very much so. So these are some aspects in terms of practice, what we have been doing so far. And in the interest of time, I'm going very quickly here. But some questions, for example, that we ask workers, does my work reflect my worth? Which is important. It's not only about the salary, but do they recognize me? Do they, engage me? Do they recognize me? Do I get, recognized for what I do? So these are the 3 lessons that I wanted to share with you very quickly. And I want to thank you for listening to me and for your patience. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them right now.
Thank you for your great presentation. To go back to the beginning, when you were looking at all the research produced at the small islands that you mentioned, I got the feeling that you basically said because of this gap between, let's say, research and actual impact on the important economics of the islands, that the universities may be somewhat shortchanging themselves with that lack of focus. Is that a way that I can understand it?
Yes. Again, let me reaffirm that I'm not saying that what have been done is not important. What I'm saying, there's a disconnect with the reality. So, and it could be, we speculate in the article that could be because grants are not available for tourism and leisure, for example. That's one. It could be about the history of the universities, because most of the universities, at least in the Caribbean, also in Mauritius, where I had the opportunity to be there several times, is that they are a kind of a reflex of universities in the mother country, which focus on certain things, so they took that as part of their heritage. So we don't know because we didn't look at those things, but what is really clear was this disconnect. And we also talked about that the consequences of this disconnect, and one of the examples is the case of St. Lucia, which is a very sad story, you know, what happened to many families and the displacement that happened there.
What could universities and or governments do to improve this, or basically reduce the
The other thing is, you know, for example, publish more. You know, there's a lot of publications, but publish on those realities that are really relevant for that particular context, and try to get into the framing of the problem. So I gave you an example here how we're trying to do it better. I'm not saying this is the best. So what we have been doing in order to try to, not only the framing, but also trying to understand better the lived experiences of the residents. Because as we said, it is that we shift the focus on the source countries, and we are looking more and more at the destinations to scaffold, you know, through empathy and belonging, to scaffold, you know, sustainability and resilience. And that means also shifting from this, I think, very negative approach, which is vulnerability. So I mean, if you look at the articles that have been written, is more about vulnerable places, vulnerable people, and so on. But they are not talking about resilience. They are not really showing why the practice. I'm giving you an example. I mean, Aruba is a small island. They shifted quickly from an oil industry economy to a service industry based on 7 miles of wide beaches. And today, the economy is $4.3 billion. So, I mean, tourism specialization can help you a lot. So it's a project in progress. What we need to learn now is, okay, you scale it up, you are at this level, we learn some things, new things, that, for example, material possessions is not the only thing. It plateaus and it can become negative. So you have to look at that. And then how do you frame that? And it's very important because at the end, a third thing that I didn't mention is you have a productivity gap with tourism, which means that over time, the cost of producing tourism will increase substantially. Why? Because you need talent. That's the human capital, right? So in order to mitigate that, you need to increase your prices. The only way to increase your prices is based on quality. So that is, you know, the new reality of several Caribbean islands. And so how do you do that? It is about the residents. It's about human capital. So how do you do the training? The training is not only the skills. For example, right now, is the same discussion in the United States. We discuss much about competencies and skills. But what about the emotional stability? You know, what about the cultural sensitivity? How do we learn that? How do we teach that? Okay, so these are the new elements that have to come into the curriculum or training in order to really, you know, focus on the next level. If tourism is to stay and become, I strongly believe that tourism has two potential outcomes. It democratizes the dollar, and it diversifies the economy, because it's a complex system. The first, nobody can tell tourism not to roam anywhere. Tourism roams and leave the dollar anywhere they want to go, unless you go to an authoritarian country. And the second thing is, tourism is a social system, an economic system with linkages to all these different sectors. It has to be deliberate. It cannot be organic.
Thank you. Thank you for the good work you've been doing on the islands. You did mention about the fact that there's limited kind of work within the islands, and that, you know, they should publish more and stuff. My end question here is, how does your work help to inform policies and strategies to either mitigate or, you know, bring it to a level that is more sustainable for the individual islands in question? because you did mention about the fact that publishing more to bring the awareness of what's going on these islands. But what front are you taking in terms of strategy and policies to influence the work you're doing? Thank you.
I can share with you my personal experience. Over time, I have moved from just publications and citations and more towards, okay, what is impact? What is the impact on society? And what I did was, COVID taught me and my colleagues something, that we moved from hospitality in the traditional sense to hospitality plus, and that we pivoted to healthcare. So what does it mean? It means that we are looking right now at, for example, disabled people in the United States. I mean, we have not applied it here in small islands. So we are looking at disabled people. There are about 60 million disabled people in the United States. We know that only 18 million travel. And they have a lot of problems because we just finished a very 2,000 survey respondents in the United States across the 50 states. And we know the constraints, how people look at them. And it's not only, the law prescribes certain things, but it's not enough. It is the stereotyping. It is how people look at them. It is, for example, if you're a paraplegic in the United States, you cannot travel by plane. If you live in Wisconsin and you want to go to Orlando to see, to visit the theme parks, you have to cross at least 8 states, and you have to look at the hospitals, the health insurance, the pharmacies, the doctors, a number of these things that, we have to be aware of. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the search cost for those travelers and understand a little bit better their experience and their family, because their family is also very, very important. So that is one way that we're trying to have a greater impact on society at large in terms of just citations. But to have an impact, you need to publish. It's like you need to show a product for your credibility. And that is what I'm missing. It's very important, and journal publications are critical because it is a peer-reviewed process. And so once you get into that, it means that you pass that grade. It means whatever your publication, it's a good publication because it had a peer review. It's good for citations, so how do you then move from your article to have that impact? And what we're doing in the States, especially at Rosen and Central Florida, is that we're embedding those things in the what we call the ASP, which is the annual evaluations. Because the annual evaluations, we have not only how many publications you have to produce per year, but also your society impact. And that determines whether you get a promotion in terms of salary, whether your professional development fund will increase, et cetera, and your rank, of course. So it has to be an institutional, systematic approach in order to really make it happen, and then, prioritize the whatever is important for the destination, whether it's tourism, whether it's offshore, whether it's finance, whatever it is.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentation as well. I had a question in regards to the studies that are done, if it's also kept into account where the tourists are coming from. I lived in Aruba myself and worked in hospitality for almost 4 years, and I noticed in Aruba, for example, 90% are tourists from the United States. Taking a look at that in comparison to Curacao, for example, working with my teams in Aruba, I felt that their appreciation of the tourist was also much, much more. Granted, for example, tourists from the United States, they tip the most, coming down to the human factor of income. When I compare a same position in Aruba to what it earns here in Curacao, a third, which is incredible considering how close, the countries or the islands are to each other. And I also think this also plays a large role in how, locals view tourism. If you're busy and you have a lot of tourists, but it's not making a change in your own income, obviously I think that's going to put a negative relation to tourism. When I compare that with Aruba, like I said, bartenders, servers, making more than people that work in banks with bachelor degrees. So I think, and also being 60%, hospitality, which is what it provides in regards to work, I think that also plays a large role on the perception of the tourism. And I think, per island, per different region, where these tourists are coming from and also what they are providing for the island also plays a large role.
I mean, I agree with you. I don't have any qualms with that, what you said. I'm a strong believer that, from an economic standpoint, tourism is also a business. So the acquisition is better from the States, is lower, compared to what they spent. From Aruba, they only spent $29 to bring in an American, and that American tourist spent about $2,000 per stay. If you compare that to the Netherlands, it's a long haul. I'm not even talking about, CO2 emissions and so on from long hauls. The acquisition cost is much higher than that, close to $40 compared to what they spent. So it is, of course, the destinations, the choice that the destination make. It could be a relationship with the past. It could be a better vision in terms of what tourism is all about and how quick that you need to move. It could be that it was triggered by a very acute crisis in Aruba to shift very quickly compared to Curacao, which has lingered quite some time between those four pillars of the economy and where to go and so on. And I've seen in the past 3 years that finally they have more focus on tourism than prior. But again, personally, I'm a little bit concerned about the focus on sources that are not really the ones that you should, really focus on. We can bring people from the moon, but if it costs you $1,000 and then they spend only $1,200, it's not a business. Okay, so that's important. That's just from a business perspective. I'm not even talking about, other layers in the relationship. Yes.
Hi. So I studied disability employment, and I was interested in what you were saying about the employees within this sector, how you measure their happiness and their willingness to leave or wanting to resign. I suspect that happens within the United States across employment sectors as well, because of the availability of employment for people with disabilities. They probably don't have what they aspire to do available to them. Did you happen to take any data related to disability when you were surveying folks about their intentions and their happiness related to their employment?
No, we haven't looked in terms of about their employment. We just looked at their willingness to travel and the type of travel, their stay, the length of stay, where they want to go, and actually, if they travel, their experience, but not where they work. That's not. Our second will be looking more at veterans. That is the next survey that we want to develop. Look at specifically at veterans, and then that will be, a larger or a broader scope than this particular one.
I was just wondering, with the surveys you did in terms of happiness and wanting to resign from hospitality, was there anything related to disability that came up within your findings with individuals?
No. We only did that study in Aruba because it's exactly what you said. On the surface, they seem okay. They seem happy. They tell you maybe politically correct responses. But when you delve deeper, we learned that from focus groups, and then we decided to have more systematic. And then it came out very, very clearly that they think quite a lot, because we asked them how many times, at what time during the day, the activity, and so very specific. And it was very clear. And I forgot to mention is also when you compare the mean and the standard deviation of the expectation and aspirations, in the case of Aruba, there are two clear groups that are the strongest in terms of the gap, the larger the gap. The young folks, the youth, and the hospitality workers. So that was very, very clear. You're welcome.
I actually am carrying over a question from the previous conference in Liverpool, where instead of talking about tourism, they talk about visitors. And it touches upon what you said, that you have to look at a different segment or something that is the same process, more or less, of attracting someone and offering a product, but not alluding to the idea of coming to paradise or including elements of servitude, which on some islands in the Caribbean, because tourism has this history, colonial history, it makes it complex to plug in the local, to bridge this divide. So basically the question is, how can we change the narrative towards visitors to make it accessible to the locals, to fill this gap, this identified gap?
Well, the thing is to create activities or events that really, facilitate the connection between locals and visitors. And most of the time, there's only very few people, locals, that come together and, or engage with visitors. But it has to be community based, where you have these, use your community strength in terms of your traditions, festivals. I mean, there is no clear example as Carnival, where locals and visitors come together and they have a very good time, for a week. At least in Aruba, that's my experience. I'm assuming in Curacao is the same thing, and other islands. So it is basically using a very strong community-led activity based on tradition and heritage, and you see what happens. So you have to look at other type of activities that could have the same, can resonate the same as, for example, with Carnival. I don't know Curacao, but in Aruba there is one called the Ramendi Guide. It's also something that is, the cockfight in Aruba is very, very strong, and tradition and heritage. So they're creating a lot of activities surrounding that in order to, by the way, it's not really cockfight, it's just, but it is the tradition about the parties, surrounding that, and the families coming together, the cooking, the music, because like in Aruba you have the Dande, which is a special type of song and music for New Year's Eve, where people in Aruba wish people Happy New Year, and the groups go from place to place, house to house, and do that. It's a very strong tradition. In Derminti Gai is the same thing. The music, the food, the way families come together, there's an opportunity. So you have to identify those strong community opportunities, that can help you engage the visitors and the residents.
I'm very glad you mentioned Carnival, because my colleague and I, Dino, we just come off the heels of investigating Carnival of Curacao and its potential and its sustainability. And what you say is precisely true, though we find that oftentimes when we say that this is an opportunity for tourism, instead of making sure that the authentic component of the event remains the same, we make it palatable for the visitor. So for example, you would include music that is not traditional to make it accessible, which makes the local feel disengaged.
Yeah.
And what are what message do you have for us at this crossroad, that on the one side you need to create something that is inclusive, but on the other side it's not inclusive because it's exclusive at this moment, and you need to open the door, so to say, so the visitor understands what's happening?
I mean, my concept of tradition or culture is a dynamic one, even of carrying capacity. It's a dynamic thing. I always give this example. If the Dutch were if their concept of carrying capacity was static, then half of the country today was on the water. I mean, they believe in their ingenuity, they believe in their future. So they didn't design to measure something, they designed for the future, for what matters. So, and the same thing with culture, it is an evolving thing, right? We did a study about authenticity in Aruba, and we used photo elicitation as a method. And we took about 130 pictures in Aruba, and we asked about 6-7 focus groups from different cohorts, population cohorts. And what we learned was there was no definition of authenticity. Everyone has their own conceptualization, what was authentic about Aruba. And it couldn't be, different because, people came from all over the world. So it is not something that it is typical. What islands in general, especially in Aruba, where I'm more familiar with, is we assemble this relationship in something different, in something new that we feel comfortable with. Today we feel comfortable with the tumba, tomorrow with the calypso. It really doesn't matter what it is. People has to feel it, right, in order that it becomes part of that person. So, and that's why we have, in the carnival, we have different genres of music.
I really like what you say because it alludes also to island studies, which is a very important element we forget when we study these spaces. That our form of innovation on an island is not by virtue of being, but by virtue of assembling. And this is something that really needs to be at the core of our policies, as I understand from your talk.
As a last observation, what I learned, for example, from COVID on the island in Aruba, I was walking on the beach, is that what if we decide to give 1 day per month a nap day for the ocean? Nap day. So there is no ocean traffic, no jet ski, no cruise, no yachts, nothing. Just let the ocean breathe and have a nap. And we estimated the amount of money that it would cost. By the scale of Aruba, it is nothing. It can be done. And actually, they're discussing about having this nap day. They have a different name for that, or they're discussing about how to call it or not. But it's a very innovative type of way of looking at sustainability, because we talk about a lot of sustainability, but I mean the actions, we look at more than 100 indicators. I was a policymaker myself. If you come with a dashboard of over 100 indicators, I can tell you I will not look at that dashboard because I don't know. You confuse me more than you're helping me. I need 1 or 2 variables that can tell me a lot of the story. And that is something that we, as researchers, we have to look, okay, what is it that matters? Not is what we can measure, but what is it that matters? And for whom? And why? And who decide on that? And that's also one of the themes of this conference.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
Dr. Robertico Croes. So we arrive at the moment where we are awarded the opportunity to stretch our legs, grab a little bit of coffee and something sweet so we continue. We'll be back in 30 minutes after our break on the patio. Thank you.